first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? But first, they have to find them. What's here? What's here? What's here? What's here?
And we are back here on the Placemakers. Once again, you are joining me. My favorite time of the week. It's when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends to talk about the future of higher education. This week, we have a very cool show. We have two gentlemen who have written recently a couple of pieces about higher education, about this return to higher education amidst this pandemic. We've got Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman, who's a professor of history of education, literacy, culture, and international education division at the University of Pennsylvania. That is a mouthful. Welcome to you. And we've got Jabir McKnight back on the show. Jabir is a co-founder of Dream Beacon and another guy who writes a whole lot of cool stuff. And lately, particularly, it's about critiquing higher education, its return in this pandemic. So I thought the two of you would be a phenomenal matchup as we talk about what's happening, why it's happening, and where we might go from here. And John, I want to start with you. Your article that you wrote in the Philadelphia Inquirer recently was really, really great, I thought. And you really hit on that hybrid model. And the hybrid model is something that institutions nationally have really started to pick up on. I think a couple months ago, Arizona State University really emerged and named it and started to talk about that as a model. And more institutions have done it. In fact, today I looked at Simpson and Scarborough's monitor on whose plans are what. And they said about 31% of institutions nationally are saying, yes, we're going to do this hybrid model. Of those, we're actually up 13% just in the month of July. So it seems like the tide is turning toward that model. And your argument is maybe that this should not be the way. In fact, I think you called it the devil's bargain in your article, which I thought was a really interesting description of that. So I'd love to hear from you about why you would call it the devil's bargain. What are people getting from that and not getting from that? Specifically, and should this be the way? Because it feels like it's the way higher education is going.
I think in our current context, TJ, hybrid is somewhat of a misnomer because if you look carefully, most schools are going to an online model. Like if you look at Stanford's statement, they say, look, online is going to be our default mode. There may be classes where we do it face-to-face, but most of it's going to be online. Now, there's extraordinary variation across schools because that's American higher ed. And let me be clear, I'm not against having courses online. I think at this moment, we do need some courses online. What I've got a problem with is deciding to bring the kids back and then not teach them. So look, there may be some really good public health reasons not to bring the students back. And if I was in a place like Tucson, right, which is a huge hotspot, maybe I wouldn't want to bring the students back. But a lot of schools are, including mine. And if they're going to bring them back, it strikes me that they should make every effort to teach them in person because, frankly, that's the least dangerous environment the students are going to be in. The chances of something bad happening to them, COVID-wise, are much greater in the dormitory and the fraternity than in the classroom.
So I want to make sure, because as I read through the article, it was really interesting. I wasn't sure as I worked my way to the bottom whether I was going to get to a place where you said this hybrid model is a bad idea, or you were going to say something else, which was that, hey, if we're going to do it, let's do it right. And that's what I think you said at the end. Really was okay.
Hybridity is going to be a part of higher education, whether we like it or not. Right? There's going to be a mixture of online and in-person instruction. In fact, there already is. What's different about our current moment is everyone's been thrown into the online bucket. See, what's happened across time is that whenever there's new technology, it's generally used to bring new voices and new people into the mix. So when there was radio, when there was TV, when there was program learning, and ultimately the internet, generally what those technologies did was they provided access to people that formerly hadn't had higher ed. So educational TV boomed right after the Second World War in the wake of the GI Bill when we brought in literally millions of new faces and people are saying, God, how are we going to teach all these people? We need a new gadget. All right. So what these gadgets have done across time generally has been to bring new faces into the mix. What's unique about this moment is everyone got thrown into the mix.
Yeah.
Including students at places like Harvard and Penn. Right.
And so I want to turn to Jabir a little bit because his argument was, the title of his article was Buyer Beware, right? And so I think what I heard him say in his article, and I don't want to speak for you, Jabir, was that, hey, if we're going to do this hybrid thing, even the hybrid thing where we bring people back and we give them some sort of discounted experience or different experience, because we're not going to have a traditional college experience. Let's just be honest with ourselves as we move into this. And this, to me, feels like the most disingenuous way to charge people full freight tuition, but that's just my opinion. That your message is, look, if we're going to do this thing, maybe you shouldn't go to school at all. Maybe you should do something different. Did I read that right?
So really my argument is, in this environment that we're in today, right? I'm not trying to discount the college experience, but where we are today in July going into August, we are not in a better place than we were in March when schools closed down. So if we're focusing on return on investment, if you're going to be paying full price to be on campus and the majority of your classes are still going to be online, and you run the risk of, public health issues that we don't even know what that looks like. fully. We don't know what this is going to look like for our health if you contract the virus down the line. So I suggest students to stay home and work remotely from their homes to save from your room and board charges. Now, if you're in a university where you're going to get paid full price regardless, I think this is a great opportunity for a gap year experience.
What do you think about that, John?
I agree with Jabir. I'd say a couple things. First of all, I think as a society, we have not demonstrated nearly enough imagination or initiative about structuring gap year experiences. I have a piece coming out next week in which I imagine what I call a civilian coronavirus corps, picking up on the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, where what we would do is we would take young adults, including college students, and say, look, if you're going to do a gap year, here's what we're going to do. We'll give you a stipend, and what you'll do is you'll hang with the kids on their off days, right? I'm talking about the K through 12 kids.
Yeah.
Most cities, including Philly, are going to some sort of on and off model.
Right.
And as it currently stands, it's untenable. What are working parents going to do when the kids are off? Like when they're not in school? How do you do your job and monitor your kids? Well, Jabir's pointing out that, there are a lot of college students who are wondering whether they should go back to school. Wouldn't it be great if we had a civilian coronavirus corps that enlisted those college students in, taking care of our public school students on the days they don't go to school? That's not rocket science. Like, we could do that. It's just we don't have the imagination and the political will.
Well, yeah, and so that's part of my question is why don't we do that? And you say it's imagination and political will. I have espoused on social media quite a bit on Twitter and not to people's delight that higher education has not exercised some of those more innovative options because it threatens our very well-being. It threatens our comfort. It particularly those folks who are in decision-making positions, and that's why we're so change averse as an industry, is that we're a little bit stuck in what we're doing. And so when you saw even here in the state of Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf just signed a bill that makes it easier for institutions to consolidate. And the comment I made to a colleague is, if we're signing that bill, it means it's too late. Right. We are so far past the point where somebody should have been having a conversation about consolidation. If we're forcing our hand politically, we're already past the point. And so what is that the reason why we haven't engaged in more innovative models is because we're a little bit change averse or a little too comfortable?
I think I don't mean to cut you off. I think universities, from my perspective as a recent graduate, a lot of universities, particularly those who have most of their operation budget comes from tuition. A lot of universities work from a defensive posture. It's about protecting the assets that you already have. So innovation, there's always inherent risk in innovation. And to innovate, most of these universities don't want to risk what they already have and put them in a position to fail. It's a business, and they're protecting their business model at the end of the day.
I'd also argue we're a follower industry. We wait, and this pandemic has been just a beautiful illustration of that. That it's like dominoes. I've been tweeting the domino gif over and over and over again, because on a given day you'll see 4 institutions say, well, we're going to move from this, and the next day it's 8, and the next day it's 10, and the next, and it's because nobody thinks independently. I always joke that my parents did not prepare me well for higher education, because when I'd walk in and make a bad decision, they would always say, well, if so-and-so jumped off a bridge, would you do that too? And what they were trying to teach me was to think independently. And it's funny that now every meeting I walk into, they go, well, what does this school do? It's the exact opposite of everything I've been taught in terms of decision making. And so I tend to argue that being as a follower industry has us a little bit broken in that regard as well.
I agree with Jabir's points and also yours, TJ. I would just add that I think that universities are inherently conservative institutions. And when I say conservative, I don't mean like in Republican or Democratic way. I mean in a dictionary way. They change very slowly. And look, part of that is, I think, valid and legitimate. Like, their job is to conserve stuff, to conserve knowledge, to conserve values. But that also makes it very difficult for them to change. One of the things I often do with my students is I do a thought experiment, sort of the classic junior high school Ouija board, where you bring like Theodore Roosevelt back to life. And if you showed him, American patterns of communication, transportation, um, uh, gender relations, race relations, he would be astounded, if not appalled. Then if you brought him to a university, he'd be like, oh yeah, I got this. I remember this. There was like a lecture and there were like a discussion section. There was a library. Like he would totally recognize it. They change extremely slowly. And one thing that changes really slowly is what De Beer was calling, quote, the college experience. See, one of the things that's unique about the United States is we tried to make research universities and the college experience at the same time, i.e. Germany and England. So we borrowed the research model from Germany, and we borrowed like the Cambridge, Oxford, you come and live here, and
residential college
thing, right? And we socialize people to expect that, the quote college experience, especially via mass media. Like, where do people get their ideas about higher ed? Not from me. All right. They get it from movies, from television, right? And from song, and all those things, teach you this version of college. College is this sort of bucolic place where there's like a chapel and a lawn, right? And very good-looking people hanging out on that lawn, just kind of chilling, right? And one of the things I think we're seeing right now is in some ways the triumph of the college experience over the academic one. Look, let's be honest. We're bringing the students back for what Kabir called the college experience, and we're not teaching them, not directly.
That's right. Well,
what more obvious statement could there be?
Right. Well, and I also wonder, have we learned sort of where your money goes, right? So I feel like the statement that we're making as an industry is that a massive portion of your tuition goes toward Frisbee and the quad. And I've used that term to be a broader generalization of the college experience, right? And those formative, which I'm a student affairs guy. I value the college experience tremendously. I think it's incredibly important in a formative time in your life. That said, I still remain very curious about how did we get to a place where the cost of higher education has increased by 1,400% since 1990. And I'm going to ask you to stay in your professor chair for a minute, John, and help us out, because I've heard two sides to that argument. I've heard that it's administrative bloat, and that if we could just get rid of the administrative bloat, everything would be fine. I've heard people say that it's technology, the thing that was supposedly going to be the promise to reduce costs for us. I have heard that it is the federal government itself and the fact that they guaranteed loans at some point that essentially incentivized institutions to grow way beyond their means. And so I'd love your perspective as a professor of history of education. What is it? What's the thing that we can pin this cost problem to? Because the ROI certainly hasn't grown at that rate.
Well, look, TJ, I mean, I'm not an economist and I don't even play one on YouTube. All right. All the things that you mentioned are real. But, earlier, Jabir said this is a business, and in a way it is. And I would say that at the end of the day, what's really driven up the cost is the demands and the expectations for college to do everything and to be everything. And look, those aren't all illegitimate. Let's take one very obvious example, the whole mental health apparatus. Mm-hmm. That basically didn't exist when I was a kid. And now it does. And you know what? It costs, right? And I'm a supporter of that apparatus. I think it's one of the most important and best things that happened in higher ed. But nothing is free. And the entire bill of goods and expectations has been transformed. So, you expect to get that and dozens of other things, right? And look, let's also face it. I mean, there's competition between these different institutions for how many different things they can provide.
Sure. And we also went through a huge amenity race, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s.
And that's a little bit like the Cold War missile race, where everybody kind of understands you probably don't need all these missiles, but the other guy has them. So, you better get yours in line.
And nobody wins, right?
Exactly, right. And so that other team, they've got a climbing wall and this beautiful new student union and all these other things. And there's also pretty good data that the economists have collected suggesting that once you get like below the very most competitive schools, a lot of students make their decisions based on the climbing walls. Not literally the climbing walls, right? but
the residence hall, the climbing wall, the gym. Yep.
services that they see there, and so look, the students are driving that. They really
Right.
are. And this, this coming fall semester is a good example of that, right? Look, nobody has to return to college, right? It's true that we've opened the doors, right? But it's not like we're putting we're lassoing these people, right, and pulling them in, right?
Right.
They're autonomous agents. They want to be there and they want all those goods and services that we're providing.
I think there's something else that's interesting about that that's driving this market that I haven't seen that we've spoken about yet is kind of the private sector. The demands of the private sector and this corporate culture that we have in the United States really, really pushes students to college. I know plenty of students that if they could have entered the job market competitively without going through college, if they could have got credentialing, or if there was another service that would get them into that space, they would have bypassed college. And you see with your Facebooks and your Googles and the tech giants, there are, I'll say, students of life that have demonstrated high level skill in their space that have gone directly to Facebook, have gone directly to Google. And I don't think any Ivy League university, regardless of their grades, if they did well and went directly to Facebook or Google, would turn them down if they put in an application.
Well, and if we articulate that at its worst, I think Scott Galloway does a pretty good job of this. He has essentially said that we have sold the American middle class a myth that you have to go to college, incur all this debt in order to have a successful life, and that perhaps that myth may not be true anymore, and that there's maybe a future that involves a different kind of credentialing or job experience or integrated corporate experience that puts you in a different position. I don't know how you feel about that.
Look, I mean, I think Jabir's right, and I think this is one of the most important things that we learn historically is that we're really living in my lifetime in the first era where formal education has become a sine qua non for self-sufficiency. It just has, right? You can argue about why that came about. You can argue about whether it's a good thing. But, I tell my students, when my wife and I lived in Baltimore in the 80s, our next door neighbor was a guy who had worked at Beth Steel his whole life.
Yeah.
And he had an 8th grade education and he owned his home. Okay.
Wow. Right.
That's never going to happen again in America, except for your occasional, pro athlete or pop music star. Nobody with a grade school education is going to own their home. And that's not because everyone back then was so awesome or schools were so awesome. They weren't. In fact, by every means we can measure, schools were much worse. It's that the structure of the economy changed, and our economy now is demanding, what Robert Reich, who worked for Clinton, called symbolic workers, analysts, white collar workers. There are a whole bunch of reasons for that, but one is, when I was in college, the People's Republic of China had the same BNP as Togo.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, the United States just dominated the globe economically in ways that we can't imagine now.
On that front,
make things better and more cheaply than we do.
Sure. Well, on that front, Jabir has talked about this notion that higher education may not be educating people for the 21st century workplace anymore. And I think that comes from his lens, and I don't want to speak for you, Jabir, but your lens with Dream Beacon and working with corporate partners and acknowledging and recognizing that as somebody graduates out of an undergraduate education and goes into the corporate world, they then spend millions of dollars to educate them again.
Absolutely. And this is not every university, but I'm just speaking for, the vast majority, and the statistics from even higher education, professionals and C-suite executives support that. They don't think university students are educated in a way that they'll thrive when they enter the workplace. And I think it comes from a lack of praxis. A lot of students are being taught the theoretical side of education, but not how to put it into practice. And you have different universities that support that learning curve when you're teaching students how to handle things from end to end, from ideation to implementation and analyzing all the way around. And I think in this environment, like Dr. Zimmerman said, and this is very important, our economy has changed. So you see with Generation Z, and we'll see it definitely with Generation Alpha, a whole group of an entrepreneurial generation, not just because you really want to own a business, but that it's needed for you to survive, to create your own second job. Some people are creating companies, but most people are creating second jobs for themselves just so they can stay above water, right? So you have the college experience rising in costs. You don't see living wage rising, but the housing market is rising as well. So how can I support myself? I create another gig in this gig economy. So how can universities raise their value by supporting students, that entrepreneurial generation? Because if they don't, we'll see a decline in desire to go through the higher education route sooner than most people expect.
You know, I think Dabir is absolutely right. And I do have just a slightly different perspective. I think he's right that a lot of college students are very poorly prepared for the workplace. But I think the answer to that is better English classes. That is, it's the humanities. So, you know, in this dialogue, often people say, well, we should prepare them for what they're going to be doing. And you can see this working in the educational marketplace. So one of the most popular majors in the last couple of years is this thing called sports management, because a lot of people like sports. And I dug into this a little bit, and I found out a few things. First of all, I found out that there aren't many jobs in sports management. So this is sort of a sham. I mean, it's a sham in the sense that we're preparing people for jobs that don't exist. But then I found something else that I think is more relevant to this conversation. Insofar as there are jobs in sports management, the people who are hiring for those jobs prefer an English major who is well educated, which is important, to a sports management major. Why? Because they've discovered that an English major who had a good education actually was more likely to get the skills that they want. You know, verbal expression, you know, oral expression, being able to synthesize and analyze. I mean, I went and looked at some of the sports management programs. I'm not going to name any of them, but I just did sort of like a Google search of them. And I was reading about some of them. And like one of them requires a course called Theory of Sports Management. You know what that is? That's bullshit. Right? There's no theory of sports management. It's not a discipline. My guess would be like some warmed over organizational psychology or sociology. It's fine, right? But again, a good English major is going to be able to kick the ass of somebody that graduates from that program, you know? And it strikes me that actually what the employers are telling us is the best vocational education is like a good English degree, like one that really teaches you to do the things that the employers want.
You know, I agree with you. I actually studied political science and English in undergrad. And
that's good too. Yeah.
How do you support those students in the humanities to understand the other sides of the business? I do agree with you there. It's like, can you teach a humanities student to understand tech through some type of credentialing or coding?
Or sales.
Sales. Yes. In that entrepreneurial space, I would hire that student before someone else that just understands the technical side.
So I just had this conversation today with a colleague where we talked about the systemic issues in higher education that make it challenging to do exactly what you're both talking about, which is to help form holistic programs that educate students for the real work world. And part of that, you know, a great example of a systemic issue is RCM funding in higher education, I think, right? Because what RCM funding does on its face is it says, you program A don't make any money, English, the humanities, liberal arts. You, College of Business, do make money. And so you get this and you don't get anything and you may die off. And in the meantime, we have ignored what our value is about holistically educating the student. And so I think there's systemic issues that get in the way of us being able to do that effectively in higher education.
There are, and I think we in the humanities, frankly, is one of our problems. We have many problems, but we haven't done a good enough job making the utilitarian case for what we do, because it seems sort of grubby, right? It's like, I don't want to, dirty my hands with filthy lucre by suggesting that a philosophy degree could actually pay out, but it actually could. If it does the kind of things that Kabir is referencing, it could. And I think that's the case that we have to make. We have to make the case that actually there is a good return on our investment. I think a good English degree beats a good marketing degree every single day. Underscoring good, one that really makes people read and write.
To forgive myself having a faculty member on if I didn't ask this question. I want to go back to the idea of increased costs and inability to pivot and change as an industry. We're like a ship on the ocean and we've struggled. And we've had a lot of guests on who have talked about the role of tenure in that. And the role that tenure plays in potentially holding back an institution from changing, and also the role that tenure plays in increasing the cost in higher education. And that some institutions that are most dynamically positioned to respond right now are those that don't deal with those challenges, community colleges as an example. And so I'd love your perspective on that, John, knowing that it's probably a little bit of an interesting topic for you. And it's been one that's been criticized on this pod.
Yeah, God, how long do we have? Look, where to start? I mean, here, this is a subject dear to my heart. I could go on forever, and I don't want to do that. I guess I would just try to summarize my view by saying that tenure was born in an entirely noble purpose, which we have to defend, which is to protect the rights of the faculty to say and think what they want. But unfortunately, in some cases, it's also been used to protect sloth and insolence. And there's nothing inconsistent about saying both of those things. I just wrote a book about the history of college teaching. And one of the things that I found, one of the inhibitors on improving college teaching, is when you said that to professors, they often said, wait a second, I've got academic freedom. This is a non sequitur. What, academic freedom to be a shitty teacher?
Right.
Like, nobody has the freedom to do that, right? But people invoked it in these radically effed up ways.
Yeah.
Tenure is necessary. It's necessary so, frankly, I can do what I'm doing exactly now.
Absolutely.
Right? I've spent my career in many ways criticizing educational institutions. And if I didn't have tenure, I think a lot of them would be quite happy to can me. But tenure should not allow me to do whatever the F I want, right, with my students, or to blow off my classes, to ignore my duties to the institution and to my colleagues. And again, I'm not saying that everybody does that, but some people do.
Sure.
And so we need to find a way to protect the freedom of the people that work at the institution to say and think and write what they want. But at the same time, make it clear that protection is not going to extend to, to all of their behaviors. Like, nobody has a right to blow off their students.
Yeah, I love that.
You should be fired.
I love, and you're pointing out a lot of the challenges people have had, which is, tenure often, while again, I believe in it at its core in terms of academic freedom and in terms of what it means to higher education and the spirit of higher education. I struggle with some of the things that are incentivized by tenure. Specifically, tenure incentivizes people, for undergrads particularly, to push undergraduate education to the side in favor of some other things.
100%. That's what my forthcoming book is about.
That I can't wait to read it, because I struggle with the notion that, particularly at Research One institutions, undergraduates are funding everything, and they are used as an input only. And it's really unfortunate. And we've propped it all up on the student experience and said, well, we give you Frisbee in the quad, so it's okay. But is it really okay?
And TJ, it's gotten worse, because now everyone wants to be a research institution, because that's where the gold is.
That's right.
There's a time when a lot of schools actually called themselves teaching institutions. And if you taught at Bowdoin College, you didn't have to publish. Some people did, right? But the idea was Boda doesn't exist for that. Boda exists for teaching. Now it's not that way. Like you don't publish a lot, Bowden's going to kick you out.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Well, I'm glad I asked the question. That's been fantastic. I appreciate that, John. So one of the things we always end this pod on is we ask about opportunities. You know, in my mind, any crisis should never go wasted. There should be an opportunity for people to not just respond, put a Band-Aid on things, and try to get back to business as usual. I hope that the industry sees this as an opportunity to pivot in a meaningful way and do things a little better. And so from both of your lenses, you know, Jabir, you do a lot of work with young people through corporate education and still work with folks in higher education. And John, you're obviously a faculty member. What should we be learning? What are the opportunities right now presented to us by this pandemic that we would just be silly if we didn't take advantage of them?
Oh, me first. So I think for the university, and this is something I wrote in my first article, I think by increasing your value, I think universities should be looking at credentialing as a part of their education, creating more co-op opportunities, aligning students with mentorship opportunities. I think that's particularly major for business students. I think you have that, but the humanities as well. If you're connecting these students with, you know, business professionals or people that are excelling in the career space that they want to enter, you'll see a rise in students that are ready for the workforce. Supporting entrepreneurship, not just for this generation, but the upcoming generation. And that's through, you know, incubation and really teaching how to scale business. That should be a part of every curriculum in my eyes, regardless if it's your business or someone else's business. It's going to boost students' value proposition. And hiring professors, I think hiring younger professors should be a priority. Not that hiring younger professors is more important than senior professors, but we're in a space where everything is changing. You want to have people that are early out of the workforce, that have experience outside of the classroom and are able to bring that to the classroom. I think that'll increase the university value proposition. And for students, I think this is an extreme opportunity to really learn more skills, not just skills for the workforce, but life skills, and really take a look at the ROI on your university and higher education, and if these moves are the right moves for you.
So after Jabir says younger faculty, I'm not going to ask you how old you are, John. I will say that similar to what you said, Jabir, when Brandon Busty was on the pod, he talked an awful lot about this opportunity to pair faculty who are great teachers with practitioners who have worked in the workforce, and how do we pair those two in really powerful ways? And maybe that helps to get at some of what you're talking about too. I think there may be more than one way to skin a cat. John, what do you think? What are the opportunities?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I think one of the opportunities is a revival of the liberal arts. I really do. You know, I don't think Kabir would have been able to accomplish all the incredible things he's done in a short time. And he's off to get this other great job and being on this show and sharing all of his experiences if he didn't have a liberal arts background. I don't think the sports management degree would have helped him get to where he is now. I really don't. The other thing I'll say is he's right about the younger professors, but we already have them. They're called adjuncts.
Adjuncts, yeah.
And they're the lumpen proletariat. You know, they're essentially the people in the galleys, who are, doing the heavy lifting and getting nothing for it. We've made a caste system in higher education. So people like myself have an actual salary with, lo and behold, health benefits. Like, who knew? There are a whole lot of people now, up to a half, who don't have that, who are teaching course by course. Now, look, to Jabir's point, if that adjunct is somebody who is like a successful professional in another field and has a well-paying day job, I'm perfectly happy, right, to sign them on as an adjunct for $3,000 a course. All right, or $5,000. But if it's a person just out of grad school has to string 4 of those together for, again, a paltry wage and no health benefits, that's just an exploitive system. Brought to you, ironically, by people that are almost entirely politically on the left, like myself, but have created this almost sort of hyper quote, free market capitalist system in which just, a relatively small number of people get the, let's just say, the benefits of surplus, and, the lowly workers generate it. It's ugly, and it's also tied up in the tenure questions that you mentioned earlier, TJ. So I would just say to your first question, what's the opportunity here? I think it's enormous, and the biggest opportunity of all is to answer the question that all of us are going to have to pose going forward, and it's actually a simple one with complex replies, which is, when and why do we have to be in the same room? That's the question going forward. The three of us are not in the same room right now.
Right.
And we seem to be doing all right. This has been, it's been an enlightening conversation. I've learned from it. Of course, most classes don't have three people.
Right.
And also three people who are, already have college educations and so on. Right. So when do you have to be in the same room? My favorite song in the Hamilton musical is The Room Where It Happens. And that's the song we all need to be singing to ourselves. What is the room where it happens? When do we have to be in the same room? Who should be there? I think there are lots of good answers to that question, and all of us need to be asking it right now, because we're not all going to be able to be in that room, but I think sometimes all of us should be. And the question is, what are those times and what are those places?
I think that is the perfect ending for the pod today. I cannot thank you two enough. This has been an engaging, enlightening conversation. And next time that you both write another piece at the same time, which I suspect will happen pretty soon, and I know, John, you've got another book coming out, I hope you'll promise to come back on the pod, because this has been fantastic for me.
Absolutely. I do have one question for Jamil.
Yeah.
I think he's wearing a fraternity T-shirt, and I'm wondering what the fraternity is.
Kappa Alpha Psi.
Oh, okay. Does Lincoln also have AOA?
AOA? No.
What's the one that like Martin Luther King and Andrew Young were in at Morehouse?
Alpha Phi Alpha.
Yeah. Alpha Phi Alpha.
Yes.
Did they have that?
We have all of the Divine Nine. Thurgood Marshall was actually an Alpha as well.
Oh, he was an Alpha? Yeah. I once read an interview with Andrew Young where he was talking about, being a freedom rider, and they said, like, what prepared you for that? And he said, listen, like, the whoopings I got from those, like, those like racist mobs, they were nothing compared to what like my Alpha brothers put on me. Like, and that's what got him ready for it. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being here. Next week, we are going to have Brandon Bustede back on the pod, along with Elizabeth Scarborough from Simpson & Scarborough, where they're going to break the data from their updated study on the enrollment management across the sector and what's going to happen in terms of our enrollment numbers. And Brandon's going to respond to that live. Before we part, I also want to congratulate Jabir on the pod. He just secured a job like today to go work on Capitol Hill. So we're excited for you, my friend, and looking forward to you doing wonderful things in the world.
Yes, and let me just add, Washington can only be improved. Right? It can't get any worse.
And it just got better because we're sending Jabir there. Thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too. Jabir, thanks for jumping on.
Nope.